The bitter October wind tore across the muddy streets of Iron Hollow like a vengeful spirit whipping snow and grit into Eleanor Harper's face as she stumbled down from the stagecoach. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each breath a sharp stab of pain. Harlan Briggs's thick fingers dug into her arm like iron claws, yanking her forward through the freezing sludge. "You're mine now, woman," he snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey and rot. "I paid good money for a wife, not some broken doll from Boston." Eleanor's vision blurred from the fresh sting of his slap. The violet bruise beneath her eye throbbed in time with her pulse. She tried to pull away, but her city boots slipped in the icy mud, sending her to her knees. Around them, miners and rough men watched with indifferent eyes. In this lawless corner of Montana territory, a mail-order bride was little more than property. No one would help her. Terror clawed up her throat as Harlan raised his hand again. The wheels of the conquered stagecoach had groaned their final protest only minutes earlier. But for Eleanor, Ellie Harper, the nightmare had truly begun the moment she set foot in Iron Hollow. 3 grueling weeks on the road from Boston had left her body aching and her spirit frayed to its limits. Everything she owned in the world rested inside a worn tapestry carpet bag, clutched tightly in her trembling hands. 2 spare calico dresses, a mother-of-pearl comb that once belonged to her mother, and the faded sepia photograph of the man who had promised her a new life. That man was supposed to be Harlan Briggs, a respectable merchant with a prosperous store. The letters he had written over 6 long months had painted pictures of safety, warm suppers, and quiet evenings far from the shadows of the East Coast. But the man now dragging her through the mud bore no resemblance to the photograph. Broad and heavy with fat, his clothes stiff with weeks of grime and spilled liquor, Harlan's small, bloodshot eyes gleamed with cruel entitlement. A ragged, tobacco-stained beard framed a mouth twisted in disgust. "About damn time you got here," he growled, his voice like gravel under wagon wheels. "Agency charged me $50 and you show up looking like something the cat dragged in. Supposed to be a pretty little city wife. Instead, I get damaged goods." Ellie kept her head down the thick veil she had worn for most of the journey, now torn by the wind. The ugly violet shadow beneath her left eye and the yellow-green bruises peeking from her high collar told a story she desperately wished to hide. They were not from Harlan, not yet, but from the ruthless men who had forced her onto that stagecoach back in Boston. Victor Langford's enforcers had made their message brutally clear: cooperate or disappear forever. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind, "there must be some mistake." Harlan laughed, a harsh, wet sound. His dirt-caked hand clamped tighter around her wrist bone, crushing in its strength. "Mistake. The only mistake is you thinking you got a choice." He yanked her forward so violently that she stumbled again, her wool skirt soaking through with icy mud. The stage driver glanced over briefly, then looked away. In Iron Hollow, a man's business was his own. From the shadowed awning of the provision store, Caleb Thorne watched the scene unfold with narrowed gray eyes. The mountain trapper had come down from Devil's Backbone Ridge only to trade a season's worth of beaver pelts. Tall and broad-shouldered, carved from the same unforgiving granite as the Rockies themselves, Caleb rarely involved himself in town affairs. Life had taught him solitude was safer. Yet something in the way this woman held herself, fragile but not yet broken, stirred a long-buried instinct. When Harlan grabbed a fistful of Ellie's hair and raised his boot to kick her, Caleb moved. A massive buckskin-clad arm shot out from the shadows. Steel-strong fingers closed around Harlan's wrist with crushing force. The big man yelped in surprise and pain as something in his joint popped sickeningly. "Let her go," Caleb said. His voice was low, resonant, carrying the quiet authority of a man who answered only to the mountains. Harlan spun, face purpling with rage. "This ain't your concern, mountain man. I paid for this bride fair and square. She's my property." Caleb didn't blink. He applied a fraction more pressure. Harlan screamed and released Ellie's hair. With one powerful shove, Caleb sent the heavier man sprawling backward into a filthy snowdrift. The street fell deathly quiet. Everyone in Iron Hollow knew better than to cross Caleb Thorne, the silent trapper who lived alone up on the ridge. Ellie remained on her knees in the mud, chest heaving, staring up at the towering stranger. He looked every bit as dangerous as the wilderness itself. Scarred hands, a heavy bearskin coat, and a Winchester rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. Yet when their eyes met, she saw something in those pale gray depths that Harlan Briggs would never possess: a steady, unshakable calm. Caleb extended one large, calloused hand wrapped in worn leather. "You're coming with me," he stated. It was not a request. It was simple, immovable fact. Ellie hesitated only a heartbeat. Behind her lay a known monster and the long shadow of Victor Langford's reach. Before her stood a terrifying unknown. Drawing a shaky breath that burned in her bruised ribs, she placed her small, cold hand into his. The warmth of his grip surprised her, firm but unexpectedly gentle. Harlan scrambled to his feet, spitting curses. "You'll regret this, Thorn. I'll have every gun in the territory hunting you down." Caleb ignored him. He retrieved Ellie's carpet bag from the mud with effortless strength and slung it over his shoulder alongside his rifle. Without another word, he led her away from the chaotic main street, his long strides measured so she could keep up. The dense emerald forest at the edge of Iron Hollow soon swallowed them whole, the towering pines closing ranks like silent guardians. As they left the noise of the town behind, the wind carried Harlan's threats fading into the distance. Ellie's heart still raced, but for the first time in months, a fragile thread of something like hope stirred within her battered chest. She did not know this man. She did not know what dangers lay ahead on Devil's Backbone Ridge. Yet as Caleb's broad back cut a path through the gathering storm, she sensed with a certainty she could not explain that whatever came next, it would not be the same as what she had fled in Boston. The trail began to climb almost immediately, steep and rocky. Dark clouds gathered overhead, heavy with the promise of snow. Ellie pulled her thin shawl tighter, already shivering. Every step sent fresh pain through her bruised body, but she forced herself forward, terrified that showing weakness might cause this stranger to abandon her. Caleb glanced back, once his expression unreadable. He slowed his pace further. The mountain waited, and with it truths that would change both their lives forever. The bitter wind howled through the towering pines as Caleb Thorne led Eleanor Harper deeper into the wilderness. The trail up Devil's Backbone Ridge climbed steeply, each step a battle against the rocky ground and her own exhaustion. Ellie's city boots, meant for Boston's cobblestones, slipped on the frozen pine needles and loose stones. Her wool skirts grew heavy with clinging snow, and every breath burned in the thin mountain air. Yet she kept moving, too afraid to show weakness in front of this stranger who had pulled her from Harlan Briggs's grasp. Caleb walked ahead, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the gathering storm. He deliberately slowed his long strides, glancing back every few dozen yards to check on her. His massive frame seemed carved from the mountains themselves, steady and unyielding. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on snow and the rising moan of the wind. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, and soon the first flakes fell sharp and relentless. Within minutes, the blizzard descended in full force, turning the world into a blinding white fury. Ellie stumbled over a fallen log, her hands scraping against rough bark as she caught herself. Pain shot through her bruised ribs and a sob threatened to escape her throat. She bit it back, forcing herself upright. Caleb stopped. He turned his pale gray eyes, assessing her shivering form. Without a word, he unclasped his heavy bearskin coat and walked back to her. The coat smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and old leather as he draped its immense weight over her narrow shoulders. Warmth enveloped her, instantly wrapping her like a protective embrace she had not known in years. "We have another mile or more," he said, his deep voice carrying easily over the wind. "Walk in my footprints. It will save your strength." Ellie nodded, clutching the thick fur tighter around her throat. She placed her boots carefully into the deep impressions he left, finding unexpected stability. The simple kindness stirred something fragile inside her chest, a crack in the wall of fear she had built since Boston. They pressed on as the blizzard raged. Snow stung her face and clung to her lashes, but Caleb's coat shielded her from the worst of it. After what felt like hours, they reached a frozen creek where ice gleamed under the fading light. Caleb paused again, watching as she struggled over the slick surface. Her lips had turned blue and violent shivers racked her frame. He guided her to a sheltered spot beneath a rocky overhang. Ellie sank down, the adrenaline that had carried her this far finally crumbling. The physical toll of her beatings, the endless journey, and the terror of the day crashed over her all at once. She buried her face in her hands, and silent, racking sobs shook her shoulders. Caleb did not interrupt. He knelt nearby, his presence solid and patient, simply letting her weep. When the tears finally eased, he spoke softly. "That man in town? He didn't put those marks on you. They're older. Who did?" Ellie lifted her head, wiping at her swollen eye. She studied his face, the strong jaw, the scars, the quiet strength. He possessed the power to harm her, yet his eyes held only patient honesty. "It was the men from back east," she whispered, her voice raw. "Victor Langford's men. My brother owed him a terrible gambling debt. When my brother died last month, Langford came for me. I had no money. only the deed to our family's land along the Gallatin River. They beat me until I agreed to come out here. They said if I ran, they would find me. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, listening. The wind howled around them, but in that moment the mountain felt a little less hostile. A faint crunch of snow made Caleb's head snap up. From the trees emerged an older man wrapped in furs leading a pack mule. Samuel Whitaker, a weathered trapper with a kind face etched by decades in the wild, raised a hand in greeting. Caleb Thorne, Samuel called, his voice warm despite the cold. Didn't expect to see you down this way with company. Caleb stood helping Ellie to her feet. Samuel, this is Eleanor Harper. We need to get her to the cabin. Samuel's sharp eyes took in Ellie's bruises and the protective way Caleb stood beside her. He nodded gravely. Harlan Briggs is already stirring up trouble in Iron Hollow. Word is he's gathering men with money from some Eastern fellow, Langford, I think they called him. They're talking about coming after you both. You best be careful up on that ridge. Ellie's stomach twisted with fresh fear, but Caleb's steady hand on her shoulder grounded her. Thank you, Samuel, Caleb said. We'll be ready. The old trapper offered them a small bundle of dried meat and a warning glance before disappearing back into the storm. His words lingered like the snow on their shoulders as Caleb and Ellie continued the final stretch. By the time the sturdy log cabin emerged through the swirling white full darkness had claimed the mountain. Built of thick, hand-hewn logs and tucked against a sheer rock face for protection, it looked like a sanctuary carved from the wilderness itself. Caleb pushed open the heavy oak door and guided Ellie inside. The interior was sparsely furnished but impeccably clean. A heavy iron stove in the center, a sturdy wooden table, a single armchair, and a wide bunk covered in thick wool blankets. Caleb quickly lit a kerosene lantern, bathing the room in a warm golden glow. He set to work adding kindling to the stove, stoking the embers into a roaring fire. Sit as close as you can tolerate, he instructed, filling a tin pot with water and setting it over the heat. Take your boots off. Wet feet will bring frostbite before morning. Ellie obeyed, sinking into the armchair with a sigh as the warmth slowly seeped into her frozen limbs. The heavy bearskin coat still draped around her carried Caleb's scent, strangely comforting. As the heat worked its way through her body, the last of her strength gave way. She buried her face in her hands once more, weeping quietly, not from fear alone this time, but from a deep, overwhelming relief mixed with sorrow for the life she had lost. Caleb prepared 2 bowls of thick venison stew from a pot kept cool in the cellar. He set one gently beside her on the table and sat across from her on a wooden stool, his movements deliberate and calm. He did not press her to speak, simply waited as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside. For the first time since leaving Boston, Eleanor Harper felt a flicker of true safety. Yet as the wind rattled the shutters, she knew the dangers from Iron Hollow and the shadows of Victor Langford were only beginning to close in. The mountain had taken them in, but it would demand its own price for shelter. Tomorrow would bring truths and trials neither of them could yet imagine. The fire crackled steadily in the heavy iron stove, casting flickering golden light across the cabin walls and chasing away the deep chill that had settled into Eleanor Harper's bones. She sat wrapped in Caleb's bearskin coat, the thick fur still carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. The warmth seeped slowly into her body, but it could not yet reach the deeper cold of fear and exhaustion lodged in her chest. Across the rough-hewn table, Caleb stirred the pot of venison stew, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. He ladled a generous portion into a tin bowl and set it before her along with a spoon carved from dark mountain wood. Eat, he said quietly. It'll give you strength. Ellie lifted the spoon with trembling fingers, the savory aroma of meat and herbs filling the small space. The first bite brought tears to her eyes again, not from pain this time, but from a simple kindness she had almost forgotten existed. For several minutes they ate in silence, the storm outside howling against the sturdy logs like a beast denied entry. Caleb watched her carefully, his pale gray eyes patient waiting. When her bowl was nearly empty, Ellie set the spoon down, the weight of everything she had carried from Boston pressed heavily upon her. She could no longer hold it alone. That land I mentioned, she began, her voice soft but steadying with each word. The deed along the Gallatin River. It's not just dirt and rocks. A surveyor discovered one of the richest silver veins in the territory running right beneath it. 300 acres that could be worth a fortune. Caleb leaned back slightly, his broad shoulders filling the space. He said nothing, only listened with the same quiet intensity that had marked every action since he had pulled her from Harlan Briggs's grasp. My brother owed Victor Langford a massive gambling debt. Ellie continued. When he died suddenly last month, Langford came for me. I had nothing but that deed passed down from my father. Langford couldn't simply steal it. The territorial courts watch claims closely now. So he forged letters in Harlan Briggs's name, arranged the marriage, and sent his men to beat me until I agreed to board that stagecoach. Once I married Briggs, the land would legally become his. Then Briggs would sign it over to Langford's company, take his payout, and Her voice faltered. I would disappear into some abandoned mineshaft. The words hung in the warm air between them. Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his scarred cheek. He stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. Men like Langford and Briggs prey on the desperate, he said, his deep voice low and resonant. They think the mountains will hide their sins. They're wrong. He rose and added another log to the stove, the flames leaping higher. Then, to Ellie's surprise, he began to share his own story. I lost my wife and daughter to cholera 6 years ago, he said, simply returning to his stool. They were everything to me. After they were gone, I came up here to Devil's Backbone. Thought solitude would keep me from feeling that kind of pain again. Built this cabin with my own hands. Trapped beaver and sold pelts. Stayed away from towns and people. His gray eyes met hers across the table. Until today. The admission touched something deep inside Ellie. For the first time, she saw beyond the towering mountain man to the quiet grief he carried. Their shared pain created an invisible bridge in the fire-lit cabin. She reached across the table without thinking, her small hand resting briefly on his calloused one. The contact sent a surprising warmth through her that had nothing to do with the stove. There's more, she whispered. The land holds meaning for the Shoshone people nearby. My father respected their sacred grounds when he bought it. Langford doesn't care. He'll destroy everything for silver. Caleb nodded gravely. I've traded with the Shoshone. They've suffered enough from men chasing wealth. This fight isn't just about you anymore. Outside, a lone wolf's howl rose above the wind, long and mournful. Ellie shivered despite the fire's heat. Caleb stood and moved to the small window, peering through a narrow gap in the shutters. The blizzard had eased slightly, but the night felt heavier now, charged with unseen threats. They'll come, he said, turning back to her. Briggs won't let this go, and Langford has money to buy guns. Samuel's warning wasn't idle. We need to be ready. He crossed to a heavy wooden chest in the corner and lifted the lid. Inside lay bandoliers of brass cartridges, a pair of Colt revolvers, and cleaning supplies. Caleb began methodically laying them out on the table, his movements precise and practiced. Ellie watched, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something new, resolve. As he worked, Caleb spoke again, his tone softer. You don't have to face this alone, Eleanor, not anymore. She looked at him, this stranger who had risked everything for her without knowing her full story. In the golden firelight, his rugged face seemed less frightening and more like an anchor in the storm. A fragile trust was forming, woven from shared vulnerability and quiet strength. Yet beneath the warmth of the cabin, tension coiled like a spring. The distant howl came again, closer this time, followed by another sound, the faint crunch of hooves on snow far down the ridge. Caleb's head lifted sharply. Ellie's breath caught. Their eyes met, and in that moment both understood. The mountain had given them shelter for one night, but tomorrow would test everything they had just begun to build. The shadows of Iron Hollow were already reaching toward Devil's Backbone, bringing with them the promise of violence and the chance for something deeper to bloom amid the danger. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the narrow gaps in the cabin shutters, painting the rough log walls in soft hues of gray and gold. Eleanor Harper had barely slept, her mind restless with the weight of revelations shared by firelight and the distant sounds that had haunted the night. She sat up on the wide bunk, pulling the heavy wool blankets around her shoulders, watching as Caleb Thorne moved with quiet purpose across the room. He had been up for hours, his face etched with concentration, as he checked and rechecked the weapons laid out on the sturdy table. They're coming, Caleb said, without turning, his deep voice calm but edged with resolve. I can feel it in the silence. Briggs and his hired guns won't wait long. Ellie rose, her bruised body protesting with every movement, but the fear that had once paralyzed her now mingled with a steely determination. The warmth of the previous night's conversation lingered between them, a fragile bond forged in shared sorrow and truth. She crossed to the table, her eyes falling on the heavy Colt revolver resting there. Its scarred walnut grip gleamed dully in the lantern light. Caleb picked up the weapon, expertly popping open the loading gate and rotating the cylinder to show it was empty. He turned toward her, his pale gray eyes steady and warm despite the gravity of the moment. Out here, survival isn't about experience, he said softly. It's about willingness. If they breach that door while I'm reloading, I need to know you won't surrender. Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the revolver. It felt impossibly heavy in her small palms, cold and foreign. Memories of Victor Langford's men beating her in Boston flashed through her mind, but she pushed them down. She was no longer that broken woman stepping off the stagecoach. "Show me," she whispered. Caleb stepped close behind her, his large frame radiating heat against the morning chill. His calloused hands gently covered hers, guiding her fingers through the motions, pulling back the hammer until it clicked, positioning her stance, teaching her to lock her wrists against the powerful kick. His breath brushed lightly against her neck as he spoke instructions, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. In that intimate proximity with danger pressing in from outside, Ellie felt a stirring deep within her heart, a blend of gratitude, trust, and something warmer, more tender. "Keep your finger off the trigger until the devil is right in front of you," Caleb murmured. "Aim for the center of the chest. Breathe out when you squeeze." She practiced the motion several times under his patient guidance, the click of the hammer echoing in the quiet cabin. Each repetition strengthened her resolve. For the first time since her brother's death, Eleanor Harper felt a spark of agency returning to her battered spirit. She was not merely surviving anymore. She was preparing to fight for the life she wanted to claim. Caleb nodded approvingly as she holstered the revolver at her hip. "You've got steel in you, Eleanor, more than you know." They spent the next hour fortifying the cabin. Caleb shuttered the windows tightly, leaving only narrow firing slits, and barricaded the heavy oak door with stacked logs. He positioned extra ammunition near each vantage point, while Ellie helped where she could, her movements growing surer with purpose. As they worked, Caleb spoke of the land once more, reminding her of its deeper meaning to the Shoshone people and the future it could represent if they survived. A sharp, unnatural crack echoed off the valley walls outside. Caleb instantly moved to a firing slit, peering down the snow-covered switchback trail. Ellie joined him, her heart hammering. "Harlan Briggs," Caleb said grimly, "and he's not alone." Through the narrow gap, they saw figures emerging from the tree line, half a mile below. 9 men in heavy dusters armed with rifles and pistols, spreading out in a loose formation. Leading them was Harlan Briggs, his arms still bound in a crude sling from their confrontation in Iron Hollow. Beside him walked a tall, lean man in a bowler hat, moving with the calculated precision of a predator. Marcus Fletcher, the disgraced former Pinkerton agent, whose reputation for cruelty preceded him. "They brought enough firepower to level this ridge," Caleb observed, his voice steady. "But they don't know the mountain like I do." The first volley of gunfire erupted without warning. Bullets slammed into the thick log walls with deafening thuds, sending splinters flying across the cabin floor. Ellie flinched, pressing herself against the stone hearth, but she didn't cower. Caleb raised his Winchester, aligning the iron sights with calm precision. "Stay low," he instructed. "Watch the front. If anything breaches, you fire." Another shot rang out from below, closer this time. Caleb exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, and one of the attackers cried out, collapsing into the deep snow. One, Caleb muttered, racking the lever with a metallic clack. The siege had begun in earnest. Fletcher's voice carried up the slope on the icy wind, barking orders to flank and advance. Ellie gripped her Colt tightly, her knuckles white. The civilized world of Boston parlors felt like a distant dream, now replaced by the raw reality of the frontier. Yet as she watched Caleb move like a phantom between the firing slits, picking off threats with deadly accuracy, a fierce courage ignited within her. During a brief lull in the shooting, as the attackers regrouped behind cover, Caleb glanced at her. His expression softened for a fraction of a second. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. "We face this together." Ellie met his gaze, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "I'm not afraid. Not with you." The sound of movement in the trees below signaled the next wave. Bullets whistled through the slits and the cabin shuddered under the assault. Caleb's jaw set with grim focus as he reloaded. Ellie raised her revolver finger, hovering near the trigger as taught. The mountain air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the distant rumble of shifting snow hinted at greater dangers yet to come. Whatever Victor Langford and Harlan Briggs unleashed, next Eleanor Harper was no longer a helpless bride. She was ready to stand and fight beside the man who had given her a chance at something real. The battle for Devil's Backbone was far from over, and the true test of their fragile bond was only beginning. The siege of Devil's Backbone unfolded with merciless fury as the morning light sharpened across the snow-covered ridge, Bullets continued to slam into the thick log walls, splintering wood and filling the cabin with the choking stench of gunpowder and dust. Caleb Thorne moved like a shadow between the narrow firing slits, his Winchester speaking with deadly precision. Each shot was measured, each breath controlled. Another hired gun fell in the snow below his cry, echoing up the slope. Ellie Harper crouched near the stone hearth, her heart pounding so fiercely she could feel it in her throat. The heavy Colt revolver in her hands no longer felt foreign. Caleb's patient guidance from earlier that morning echoed in her mind. Breathe out, aim center, don't hesitate. She watched him reload with swift, practiced movements, his broad shoulders tense but steady. A sudden burst of gunfire raked the front wall. One bullet punched through a slit and whistled past Caleb's head close enough to tear a shallow gash along his temple. Blood trickled down the side of his face, but he didn't flinch. Ellie's stomach clenched with fear, not for herself, but for the man who had risked everything for her. "Caleb," she cried. "Stay down," he ordered, voice calm despite the chaos. But the attackers were growing bolder. Marcus Fletcher's sharp commands carried on the wind as his men tried to flank the cabin from the side. Harlan Briggs's drunken shouts mixed with threats promising slow deaths for both of them. Ellie's jaw tightened. She was no longer the trembling woman in the mud of Iron Hollow. Something fierce had awakened inside her. During a brief lull as the gunmen regrouped behind the thick pines, Caleb slid down beside her, breathing hard. His gray eyes met hers, softening for a moment amid the violence. "You all right?" he asked, wiping blood from his face with the back of his sleeve. Ellie nodded, though her hands shook. "I'm here. With you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I've been alone so long, Caleb. After my brother, after Langford's men, I thought this was how my life would end. In fear, in silence." Caleb's large hand covered hers, briefly warm and grounding. "I know that silence. Lost my family and hid up here thinking it would protect me from more pain. But meeting you, it reminded me there's still something worth fighting for." His voice carried quiet regret and budding hope. "We're not alone anymore, Eleanor." The intimate words hung between them, a tender anchor in the storm of lead. Ellie felt a surge of strength, her bruised heart opening just a little wider despite the danger pressing in from all sides. The moment shattered as fresh gunfire erupted. Fletcher's men had shifted tactics, trying to circle behind the cabin. Caleb sprang up, firing through the rear slit. Ellie rose too, positioning herself at the front as he had taught her. When one attacker broke cover and charged toward the door with a lit stick of dynamite in hand, her blood ran cold. She didn't think. She simply acted. Raising the Colt, Ellie locked her wrists, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The revolver bucked hard in her grip, the roar deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, spinning him backward. The dynamite fell short, exploding in a shower of snow and rock well away from the cabin. But the shot had drawn attention. Return fire chewed through the wood near her head. Caleb was at her side instantly, his Winchester thundering in reply. "Good shot," he said, pride and concern mixing in his tone. "You saved us both." The battle stretched on for hours, sweat mixed with blood and gunpowder on their faces. Caleb picked off 2 more attackers with unerring aim, but Fletcher was cunning. The disgraced Pinkerton pulled his remaining men back into deeper cover, then ordered them to use the last of their dynamite not on the cabin itself, but on the rocky overhang high above. The first muffled explosion shook the ground, then another. Caleb's eyes widened in sudden horror. "They're not trying to blast us out," he realized. "They're bringing the mountain down on us." A deep, terrifying rumble began high on the ridge, like thunder trapped beneath the snow. It grew rapidly into a deafening roar that vibrated through the cabin floorboards. The avalanche was coming. "We have to move now," Caleb roared. He grabbed Ellie around the waist with one powerful arm, hauling her to her feet. Snatching her tapestry bag containing the precious deed and his own rifle, he kicked open the heavy back door that led to a narrow rocky crevice shielded from the main slope. They burst into the freezing air just as the mountain gave way. A colossal wall of white death, thousands of tons of compacted snow ice and uprooted trees cascaded over the precipice with the force of a runaway train. The cabin's thick log walls, built to withstand a century of storms, groaned and shattered like matchsticks. The roar was absolute, drowning out thought and breath. Caleb threw Ellie into the narrow crevice and pressed his massive body over hers, shielding her completely from the flying debris and suffocating powder. She buried her face against his chest, clutching his shirt as the world tore itself apart around them. His heartbeat, strong and steady beneath her cheek, was the only thing anchoring her to life. For what felt like an eternity, the avalanche thundered past. when the deafening noise finally subsided into an eerie settling hiss of shifting snow. Caleb slowly lifted himself. The cabin was gone, buried beneath an impenetrable mound of ice and splintered timber. Several of Fletcher's men had been swept away or entombed in the white grave. Caleb brushed frost and debris from Ellie's hair, his calloused fingers lingering gently on her cheek. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears freezing on her lashes. "I'm alive because of you." They emerged from the crevice into a devastated landscape. The front trail was completely buried. Harlan Briggs and the surviving gunman were nowhere to be seen, either dead or fleeing in terror. But both knew Victor Langford would not stop. "We can't stay here," Caleb said, scanning the unbroken white wilderness. "Fletcher may have survived and more men will come. We need to reach Helena, federal jurisdiction. Judge there won't be bought by Eastern money." Ellie looked at the treacherous mountains stretching before them. The journey would be brutal weeks through the harshest terrain in the territory. Doubt flickered in her eyes. "I'll only slow you down." Caleb turned to her, his pale gray eyes fierce with quiet devotion. He gently wiped a frozen tear from her bruised cheek. "I didn't pull you out of that mud to leave you in the snow, Eleanor. You're coming with me." We walked together. In that moment, standing amid the ruins of the cabin and the avalanche's wake, something profound shifted between them. Ellie reached up, placing her small hand over his. The mountain had tried to bury them, but instead it had forged the beginning of an unbreakable bond. Ahead lay a frozen odyssey of survival healing and a love strong enough to defy the wilderness itself. The journey across the frozen Sawtooth Range tested every ounce of strength Eleanor Harper possessed. For 22 agonizing days, she and Caleb Thorne trudged through the unforgiving Montana winter, leaving the buried ruins of Devil's Backbone far behind. The avalanche had saved them from immediate death, but it also stripped away any illusion of safety. Victor Langford's shadow still loomed, and the wilderness demanded payment for every mile they gained. Each dawn brought new challenges. Ellie's once delicate hands, now calloused and windburned, learned to skin snowshoe hares and build fires from damp pine needles. Caleb walked beside her with patient endurance, his deep voice guiding her through the subtle language of the mountains. How to read the wind's shift before a storm, how to find shelter beneath rocky overhangs, and how to conserve energy when the thin air stole breath from their lungs. "You're stronger than you know," he told her one evening as they huddled beneath his bearskin coat beside a small fire. The flames danced low, casting warm light on their faces. Snow fell softly beyond the shelter of the pines. Most city folks would have given up by now. Ellie leaned against his solid shoulder, drawing comfort from his steady warmth. The bruises on her face had faded to pale shadows, but the deeper wounds inside her were slowly healing with every shared hardship. "I was broken when you found me, Caleb, afraid of my own shadow. But you make me want to fight for something better." In the quiet nights, their conversations deepened. Caleb spoke more of his lost wife and daughter, the emptiness that had driven him to the ridge, and the guilt he still carried for surviving them. Ellie shared memories of her mother's gentle strength and her father's quiet love for the land along the Gallatin River. Their words wove a fragile tapestry of trust and understanding, turning two wounded souls into companions who no longer feared the silence between them. On the 12th day, as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm Ellie, they stumbled upon a small, weathered cabin tucked in a secluded valley. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a beacon of hope in the white wilderness. An elderly woman stepped out to greet them, her silver hair braided neatly and her eyes sharp with the wisdom of years lived hard. "Abigail Whitaker." She introduced herself, her voice warm and steady. She was Samuel's widowed sister, living alone after losing her husband to a mining accident years earlier. "Come inside before the cold takes you both." The cabin smelled of fresh bread and herbs. Abigail moved with quiet efficiency, serving hot stew and strong coffee while listening to their story without judgment. Over the next 2 days of rest, the old woman became a gentle anchor for Ellie. They sat together by the fire while Caleb repaired snowshoes outside. "I see the way you look at him," Abigail said softly one afternoon, her wrinkled hands busy with mending. "And the way he looks at you. Love born in hardship runs deeper than any parlor romance. I lost my Thomas Young, thought the sun would never shine again. But time and kindness taught me that second chances come when we're brave enough to reach for them." Her words touched something profound in Ellie. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she spoke of her fears of not being enough for Caleb, of the dangers still waiting in Helena. Abigail listened with the patience only a woman who had lived long could offer, sharing stories of her own losses and the quiet joys she had found in solitude and helping travelers like them. "You've already survived more than most could bear," Abigail told her. "The mountain didn't break you. It's remaking you into something stronger. Don't be afraid to let your heart heal alongside your body." Those days with Abigail gave Ellie renewed strength. She practiced with her Colt revolver in the snow, her aim growing surer. Caleb watched with quiet pride, his lingering glances now filled with open affection. One night as the three of them sat by the fire, Caleb's hand found Ellie's beneath the table. The simple touch sent warmth blooming through her chest, a tender promise amid the uncertainty. When it was time to leave, Abigail packed them dried meat, extra blankets, and a small tin of salve for their weary hands. She hugged Ellie tightly, whispering, "Hold on to that man-child, and hold on to the woman you're becoming." The final leg of the journey was still brutal, but Ellie faced it with new resilience. She no longer stumbled as often. Her steps matched Caleb's more steadily, and her laughter, rare and precious, echoed softly across the frozen ridges when he teased her gently about becoming a true mountain woman. Their bond deepened with every shared glance and quiet conversation by the campfire. What had begun as protection had blossomed into something deeper, more mature, a love forged in survival, respect, and mutual healing. On the 22nd day, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and gold, they crested a final rise. In the distance, the lights of Helena twinkled like scattered stars against the gathering dusk. The boomtown sprawled below, alive with the chaos of silver fever, yet offering the promise of federal justice and a new beginning. Caleb stopped, his large hand resting gently on Ellie's back. "We made it," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Together." Ellie looked up at him, her heart full. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off that stagecoach in Iron Hollow was gone. In her place stood a woman tempered by the wilderness, ready to claim her land, her future, and the love that had carried her through the storm. Yet as they gazed at Helena, both knew the greatest trial still awaited them, confronting Victor Langford himself. The journey had healed them, but justice would demand one final stand. The bustling streets of Helena greeted Eleanor Harper and Caleb Thorne like a chaotic dream after weeks of frozen silence. The boomtown pulsed with life freight wagons rumbling over muddy avenues, miners shouting prices for silver claims, and the scent of wood smoke, horse sweat, and fresh bread mingling in the crisp air. After 22 days of survival across the Sawtooth Range, the noise and movement felt almost overwhelming. Yet Ellie walked with her head held high, the heavy Colt revolver resting naturally against her hip beneath her coat, her tapestry bag clutched securely in her gloved hand. Caleb stayed close, his Winchester slung over one broad shoulder, his presence a solid shield amid the crowd. Their eyes met often now, filled with the quiet understanding forged in firelight and snow. The journey had changed them both, turning protection into partnership and two broken hearts into something stronger. Their destination was the Federal Land Office Annex attached to the courthouse on Harrison Avenue. Judge Harlan Whitaker, known throughout the territory for his unyielding integrity, held the authority to validate claims against Eastern opportunists. As they pushed open the heavy oak doors, warmth from a pot-bellied stove washed over them, along with the scent of polished mahogany and ink. But the moment they stepped inside, the air turned to ice. Standing near the clerk's counter, smoking an expensive cigar, was Victor Langford. The ruthless Boston crime boss looked impeccably dressed in a tailored silk suit, completely out of place among the rough frontiermen. His eyes widened in genuine shock as they landed on Ellie, then narrowed with cold calculation. "Well, I'll be damned," Langford drawled, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "Miss Harper, they told me you died in an avalanche down south. I even have a forged death certificate ready to transfer your little Gallatin River property to my holding company." Three armed enforcers behind him shifted hands, dropping to their holsters. Ellie's heart slammed against her ribs, but she refused to shrink. The woman who had crossed mountains on foot stood tall. "You're a long way from your Boston alleys, Mr. Langford," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying the icy resolve of the peaks she had conquered. "That land belongs to my family. I'm here to register the deed with Judge Whitaker." Langford laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed through the paneled room. He snapped his fingers. His men drew their revolvers with metallic clicks that froze the terrified court clerk behind the counter. "You aren't registering anything?" my dear Langford sneered, stepping closer. "Hand over that bag and you and your mountain animal can have a tragic accident in the alley. No federal judge will ever see you." The tension crackled like dry lightning. Caleb's hand hovered near his own weapon. His pale gray eyes locked on Langford with the cold focus of a predator. But before the enforcers could act, Ellie moved. All the grueling hours of practice on icy ridges, all the fear she had transformed into strength, culminated in one fluid motion. She drew the Colt, locked her wrists exactly as Caleb had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The deafening roar shattered the windows. The bullet intentionally smashed into the mahogany pillar inches from Langford's head, showering him with sharp wooden splinters. Langford screamed, dropping his cigar and falling to his knees in terror. The enforcers hesitated for a critical second. Caleb exploded into motion. His revolver barked twice, shattering the gun hands of two men. The heavy barrel of his Winchester crashed down on the third man's skull with a sickening thud. In less than 5 seconds, the confrontation was over. Ellie stood over the trembling crime boss, the smoking barrel of her Colt leveled at his chest. Her hands were steady now. The doors to the annex burst open. U.S. Marshal Thomas Riley stormed in with 4 deputies' rifles raised. He surveyed the shattered room, the bleeding enforcers on the floor, and the Boston criminal kneeling before a fiercely determined woman. Marshal Riley. Ellie said calmly, never taking her eyes off Langford. "My name is Eleanor Harper. This man forged documents and attempted murder to steal my family's land claim. I have the rightful deed, and I would like to see Judge Whitaker now." The marshal chuckled, holstering his weapon and signaling his deputies to arrest Langford and his men. "Well, ma'am, consider him securely booked. I reckon Judge Whitaker will be mighty pleased to validate that deed for a woman with aim like yours." In the hours that followed, the federal land office became a place of justice rather than fear. The court clerk, a quiet man named Elias, who had watched the scene with wide eyes, stepped forward with unexpected courage. He provided testimony about Langford's threats and produced records proving the forgery. Judge Whitaker, a stern but fair man in his 60s, reviewed the original deed with careful attention. His gavel came down with finality. "The claim along the Gallatin River is hereby officially registered in the name of Eleanor Harper," he declared. "Any attempts to contest it will be met with the full weight of territorial law." Ellie stood beside Caleb as the documents were stamped and signed. The weight that had crushed her for months finally lifted. She was no longer hunted. She was a woman of means, owner of land, rich, with silver and history. Yet as they stepped out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun warming the bustling streets of Helena, a deeper truth settled in her heart. Caleb walked quietly beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You have your fortune now, Eleanor," he said, stopping at the edge of the boardwalk. His voice carried a flicker of unfamiliar vulnerability. "You could buy the finest house in Denver, live in safety and comfort. You don't need a mountain trapper anymore." Ellie stopped turning to face the towering man who had saved her life, taught her to survive, and quietly stolen her heart. She dropped her tapestry bag onto the boardwalk, ignoring the curious stares of passing miners. Stepping close, she rested her hands against the worn leather of his coat. "I didn't survive the mountain to live in a mansion, Caleb," she whispered fiercely, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I survived it so I could build a life on it with you." Caleb's breath caught. He looked down at the woman who had conquered the frontier and his guarded heart. Without another word, he wrapped his powerful arms around her waist, lifted her effortlessly, and pulled her into a deep, tender kiss, filled with all the love, respect, and devotion they had earned through fire and snow. As they embraced on the busy Helena Street, the future stretched before them, rich with possibility, healing, and the promise of home. Yet both knew the final choice awaited them fully in the days ahead, how they would shape their new life together on the Gallatin Riverland, far from the shadows of the past. The mountain had forged them, and now it was time to build something lasting. The days following the confrontation in Helena passed in a gentle haze of paperwork and quiet hope. With Victor Langford securely behind bars and her claim to the Gallatin Riverland officially recognized, Eleanor Harper stood on the sunlit boardwalk beside Caleb Thorne, her hand resting comfortably in his large, calloused one. The weight of fear that had defined her life for so long had finally lifted, replaced by a profound sense of freedom and possibility. "I meant what I said, Caleb," she told him softly as they watched the bustling town life flow around them. "I don't want a fancy life in Denver. I want the mountains. I want a home with you." Caleb looked down at her, his pale gray eyes warm with a tenderness that had grown steadily through their shared trials. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then that's what we'll build, Eleanor. Together." They wasted little time. With part of the silver claim already drawing interest from honest miners, they hired a small crew and supplies, then made the journey back to the Gallatin River Valley. The land was everything her father had promised, and more rolling meadows bordered by towering pines, the clear river sparkling under the spring sun, and the distant peaks standing guard like old friends. Though the original cabin on Devil's Backbone was lost forever, this new ground felt like a true beginning. Over the following months, they built a sturdy home with their own hands. Caleb taught Ellie the rhythms of frontier life, while she brought small touches of warmth that transformed the cabin into something more than shelter. Wildflowers filled jars on the windowsills, colorful quilts covered the beds, and the aroma of fresh bread often welcomed Caleb home from checking trap lines or working the claim. Their days were filled with honest work, shared laughter, and evenings spent talking by the fire about dreams both old and new. One crisp autumn evening, as golden light spilled across the river, Caleb found Ellie sitting on the porch steps watching the water flow. He sat beside her, wrapping a strong arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him naturally, her head resting against his chest. "I was so afraid when you first took my hand in Iron Hollow," she whispered. "I thought I was walking toward another kind of prison. Instead, you gave me freedom. You gave me back myself." Caleb's voice was thick with emotion as he held her closer. "And you gave me a reason to stop hiding from life. I spent years thinking love only brought pain. You showed me it can also bring healing." Their love had grown slowly and deeply like the roots of the ancient pines surrounding them. It was not the fleeting passion of youth, but something stronger, built on respect, shared hardship, and the quiet understanding that comes only with time and trial. In the nights that followed, they spoke of the future, expanding the claim, fairly helping neighboring families, and perhaps one day welcoming children of their own into this wild, beautiful world. Years passed gently across the Gallatin Valley. The silver mine provided comfort without excess, allowing them to live simply but well. Caleb and Ellie became known throughout the territory, not only for their prosperity, but for their kindness, offering shelter to travelers, supporting the local Shoshone community, and standing up for those who had been wronged by men like Langford and Briggs. On a warm summer afternoon many years later, an elderly Eleanor Thorne sat on the wide porch of their home, her silver hair catching the sunlight. A young granddaughter named Clara sat at her feet, listening wide-eyed as the old woman told the story of a bruised bride who arrived in Iron Hollow and the silent mountain man who changed everything. "I was broken when I stepped off that stagecoach," Ellie said softly, her voice still carrying the gentle strength of the woman she had become. "But one man's courage reminded me that kindness can appear when we need it most. The mountains tried to bury us, but instead they forged us stronger. Never be afraid to reach for a second chance, my dear, and never underestimate what a single act of compassion can do." Clara looked up at her grandmother, then at the tall figure of Caleb approaching from the fields, his steps slower now, but still steady. Even after all these decades, his eyes still lit with the same quiet devotion when they found his wife. Ellie smiled as Caleb joined them on the porch, lowering himself carefully beside her and taking her hand in his, their fingers wrinkled with age but still perfectly fitted, intertwined naturally. "The frontier was never tamed by romance alone," Ellie said, looking out across the land they had built together. "It was carved by survival courage and the kind of love that chooses to stay through every storm. And we were unbreakable because we faced it side by side." As the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of soft gold and rose, Eleanor and Caleb sat together in peaceful silence. The horrors of Boston and the dangers of Devil's Backbone had faded into distant memory, leaving only the enduring legacy of hope, healing, and love forged in the heart of the wilderness. In the end, the greatest treasure they found was not the silver beneath the earth, but the life they had chosen to build together, one filled with quiet strength, compassion, and the beautiful certainty that even in the harshest places, love could always find a way home.